3 weeks before I was supposed to move into my college dorm, I called the bank to confirm my tuition wire transfer. It was a Tuesday morning, mid-July, and the air conditioning in our house had been acting up again, running loud and uneven like it always did in the Georgia heat. I was sitting at the kitchen counter in the same spot I'd sat for breakfast every morning for the past 12 years, with a notepad in front of me and a list of things to do before move-in day. The call to the bank was number 3 on that list, right between confirm dorm bedding order and pick up shower caddy from Target. Routine. Completely routine. The woman on the phone asked me to verify my account details, and I did, because that's what you do. I read off the account number the way you read off a phone number you've memorized. No hesitation. The account had been opened the month I was born. I'd known the number since I was 12. I had rehearsed this exact call in my head 100 times. In every version, it lasted 4 minutes, ended with a confirmation number, and I crossed item 3 off my list. That was the version I was living inside when I picked up the phone. That was the only version I thought existed. And then she went quiet. Not a brief pause, the kind you get when someone's pulling up a screen. A long, hollow silence. The kind that has weight to it. The kind you can feel pressing against your ear. Mr. Calloway, her voice had changed. Careful now. The way a doctor's voice changes before they say something they've been trained to deliver. The current balance on this account is $1,984. I laughed. Out loud. Not because it was funny, but because my brain genuinely could not process what I just heard as reality. There were supposed to be $187,000 in that account. My grandparents had been building it since the day I was born, one birthday, one holiday, one careful deposit at a time, for 18 straight years. So when she said $1,984, my first thought was that there had been some kind of system error. A display glitch, a misread account number, something fixable. I asked her to check again. She did. I could hear keyboard clicks on her end, another silence. Then she told me about the withdrawals. 11 of them, spread across 9 months, ranging from $8,000 to $14,000 each. All authorized by the account custodian. My mother, Sandra Calloway. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood completely still while the refrigerator hummed and the ceiling fan turned, and the world kept moving like nothing had happened. Through the back window, I could see my sister Kayla's new car in the driveway. The one my parents said was bought with a work bonus. Standing there in that kitchen, watching that car sit in the driveway catching the morning sun, I understood before I could even articulate it that the bonus had never existed. Before we go any further, if you've ever been the invisible child in your family, the one who worked hard and stayed quiet and still somehow came last, I think this story is going to mean something to you. Subscribe if it speaks to you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And now, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Harlow Creek, a small town in Georgia where the summer heat makes the pavement ripple and everybody knows your last name. It's the kind of town where people wave when they drive past you on the road, not because they necessarily know you, but because waving is just what you do. Where the 4th of July parade still goes down Main Street and half the town lines the sidewalks with folding chairs. Where your family's reputation can follow you from elementary school all the way through graduation, and nobody ever really forgets anything. My parents, Sandra and Gerald Calloway, raised 2 kids in a beige split level on Crescent Drive, a house that always smelled faintly of dryer sheets and the lemon dish soap my mother used religiously. We had a dining room table we never ate at, a living room couch where my mother spent most of her evenings, and a backyard with a rusted swing set that neither of us had used in years, but my dad refused to take down. My older sister Kayla was 4 years my senior, and she was, without question, the sun around which our family had always revolved. I want to be fair here, because this story isn't about hating Kayla. She didn't ask for the position she held in our family, and she didn't know what was being done in her name. But growing up, the difference in how we were treated was something you could measure with a ruler. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't occasional. It was the operating system the household ran on. Kayla struggled in school, and that became a reason to protect her. When she failed a class her junior year of high school, my mother went to the school and sat in the principal's office for 2 hours advocating for a grade change. When I got a B- on a test once in 8th grade, 1 B-, in the middle of a semester where I had all A's, my mother said, "Well, you'll do better next time," and went back to her phone. Kayla switched majors 3 times in college, and that became a reason to celebrate her flexibility. Every shift was treated like a sign of growth, a young woman discovering herself. When I chose my major before I'd even enrolled and stuck with it, nobody mentioned it. She moved back home at 25 after her apartment lease fell through, and my mother had her old room repainted within 2 weeks. Soft gray with white trim, the color Kayla had always wanted, but the room had never been. There were new curtains, a new lamp. It looked better than it ever had when she was a teenager. Meanwhile, I made honor roll every semester from 6th grade through senior year without missing once. I ran cross-country and placed in 3 regional meets. I worked 20 hours a week at a hardware store on Route 9 starting at 16, paying for my own school supplies, my own clothes, my own college application fees. Not because my parents couldn't afford to help, but because it never occurred to anyone to offer. And I never asked, because I had been taught, without anyone ever saying the words directly, that asking was for people who needed things. I was the one who didn't need things. Every time I brought something home, an award, a commendation, a scholarship notification, my mother would look up briefly and say, "Good job, Nolan," then go back to whatever conversation she was having about Kayla. The words weren't unkind. They were just empty, the kind of acknowledgement you give to a passing stranger who holds a door for you. Polite, forgettable. I got used to it. That might be the saddest sentence in this whole story. I got used to it, and I told myself that being self-sufficient was a virtue, that needing less was a strength, that people who required constant validation were weak. I built a whole identity out of not needing anything from anyone. But there was one exception to that pattern. One person in my life who never treated my accomplishments like background noise. The only person who ever treated my achievements like they genuinely mattered was my grandfather, James Beaumont. Grandpa James and my grandmother, Carol, lived 40 minutes away in Millfield, in a small brick ranch house with a vegetable garden in the back that Grandpa James tended with the same seriousness other men reserved for careers. He grew tomatoes, green beans, squash, and every summer, a crop of sweet corn that he'd bring over in paper bags and leave on our porch without announcing himself. He was quiet in the way that genuinely quiet people are, not reserved, not withholding, just someone who believed words should carry weight and therefore used them deliberately. I spent every other weekend there from the time I was 7. Not because my parents arranged it out of some strategic sense that I needed more attention, but because Grandpa James asked, and my parents, likely relieved to have one less kid in the house, said yes. I don't think they ever understood what those weekends meant to me. I'm not sure it would have changed anything if they had. It was Grandpa James who came to my cross-country meets when my parents couldn't find the time. He drove 40 minutes each way, stood on the sideline in whatever weather, and when I finished, he'd shake my hand first, not hug me, shake my hand, like a man greeting another man, and say, "Good race." 2 words. But the way he said them made you feel like you'd done something real. It was Grandma Carol who framed my honor roll certificates and hung them in the hallway of their house, between old family photographs and a watercolor print of the Georgia coastline. Visitors who came over would see my name on those frames. I used to stand in that hallway and just look at them, not out of vanity, but because seeing them there made them feel real in a way they never did at home. Grandma Carol passed away when I was 13, from a stroke that came without warning on an ordinary Wednesday morning. I remember my father getting the phone call. I remember the drive to Millfield feeling different from every other drive there. I remember walking into that house and thinking it was already quieter without her in it, even though she'd never been a loud person. After she was gone, Grandpa James carried the weekends alone. He learned to cook things that weren't in his original repertoire: chicken soup, banana bread, pasta that wasn't quite right, but that he kept trying to improve. He never talked about being lonely. He just kept the garden, kept the house, kept calling on Sunday evenings. And he kept being the one constant thing in my life that felt solid. It was Grandpa James who sat me down when I was 11 years old, at his kitchen table with 2 glasses of sweet tea and the ceiling fan going overhead, looked me square in the eye and said, "Nolan, your grandmother and I have been saving money for you since the day you came home from the hospital. It's yours for college, for your future. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise." I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that my mother had discovered the account 2 years earlier, talked her way onto it as a secondary custodian after Grandma Carol passed, and had been withdrawing funds every single month since the previous October. I found all of this out standing in my family's kitchen, still holding the phone, doing the math on 9 months of withdrawals that came to just under $187,000. I found my mother in the living room. She was watching television, feet tucked under her on the couch, a glass of sweet tea on the side table, a rerun of something playing at low volume. An ordinary Tuesday morning. Nothing in her posture suggested she was a person with anything to account for. I stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed me. When she did, she reached for the remote and muted the TV, not turned it off, muted it, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed patience. Like she had been expecting this conversation and had already decided how it would go. I asked her directly where my college fund was. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look away. She said, "We used it for Kayla's house down payment. She needed stability, Nolan. You've always been able to figure things out on your own." The room shifted. Not physically, but something in my chest cracked open, not with grief, not yet, but with the specific and nauseating recognition of something you've suspected for years finally being confirmed. All those years of good job, Nolan. All those years of the easy one, the capable one, the one who doesn't need anything. It hadn't been a failure of attention. It had been a policy. I asked her how she justified taking money that my grandparents had saved for me over 18 years and giving it to someone else. My voice was steady. I don't know how. She stood up slowly, the way people do when they want the height advantage without seeming aggressive, and said, "Because your sister has always needed more from this family than you have. You're capable. She's fragile." I made a judgment call. And then she said the sentence I will never, for the rest of my life, forget. "Kayla has always been the one who actually mattered in an emergency. You've always been fine." She said it the way you'd say the sun rises in the east. A fact. Settled. Not even worth debating. Not a confession, not a justification, just a statement of how the world was organized as far as she was concerned. As if 18 years of my grandparents' labor, of birthday deposits and Christmas contributions and carefully managed savings, could be redirected because she had decided, unilaterally, that her scale of who mattered more was correct. There were things I could have said. I had about 40 of them lined up somewhere in my chest, pressing against my ribs. But I understood, standing there in that living room, that there was nothing I could say that would matter to her. She wasn't waiting for my response. She had already moved on inside her own mind. The television was still on, just muted, and her hand was still loosely holding the remote. I didn't respond. I walked to my bedroom, closed the door quietly, not slammed it, closed it, because even then I wasn't going to give her the dramatic scene she could later describe as me being unreasonable. Sat on the edge of my bed and called Grandpa James. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. The bank balance, the 11 withdrawals, what my mother had said. I didn't cry. I just reported it, detail by detail, the way you'd read from a document, because if I let it become emotion, it would break into something I couldn't put back together before I'd said everything that needed to be said. When I finished, there was silence. About 15 seconds of it. The kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that's full of someone making a decision. Then Grandpa James spoke in a voice I'd never heard from him before. Quiet, measured, like a man who had already made a decision before the words came out. "Nolan, stay where you are. Don't confront anyone else tonight. I'm calling Franklin Webb first thing tomorrow morning." Franklin Webb was the most respected estate and family law attorney in our county. I'd heard his name at church functions for years, attached always to words like thorough and fair, and not someone you want on the other side of a case. I asked Grandpa James if he was sure, if he understood what this would mean for the family. He said, "I understand it better than you think. Your grandmother saved that money one paycheck at a time for 18 years. A pause. Sandra didn't earn the right to touch a single dollar of it. Then, get some sleep. We'll talk in the morning." I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sound of the television still playing in the living room, and understood that whatever happened next, there was no version of the story where everything went back to normal. Normal was a door that had just closed permanently behind me. I couldn't see what was on the other side yet, but I knew there was no going back through. Grandpa James met with Franklin Webb 2 days later. I sat at the conference table beside him with a folder containing every bank statement, every account letter, every piece of documentation Grandpa James had kept since the day the account was opened. Which, because he was Grandpa James, was everything, organized chronologically in a manila folder with a rubber band around it. Franklin Webb was 60-something, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of a man who had sat across from a lot of difficult situations and stopped being surprised by any of them. He spread all the documents on the table, reviewed them in silence for several minutes, made a few notes in the margins of his legal pad, then leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Beaumont," he said, "this is a straightforward custodial misappropriation case. The account was established as a UTMA, a Uniform Transfers to Minors Act account, which means every dollar deposited into it legally belonged to Nolan from the date of each deposit. The custodian's role is to manage the funds on the minor's behalf, not to redirect them for other purposes. Your daughter had no legal right to make withdrawals for any purpose other than Nolan's direct benefit." He paused. "What she did constitutes felony theft under state statute." The word felony sat in that conference room like a stone dropped in still water. Grandpa James asked what the options were. Franklin outlined two: a civil suit for full restitution of the misappropriated funds, and a criminal complaint filed with the district attorney's office. He explained both in plain language, noting that they weren't mutually exclusive, and that in cases like this one, the paper trail was unusually clean. Grandpa James looked at me. I said, "Both." Franklin nodded and picked up his pen. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. When we walked out into the afternoon sun, Grandpa James put his hand briefly on my shoulder, just for a second, just once, and said, "You did the right thing calling me." I had been holding myself together tightly since the phone call at the bank 2 days earlier. Something about that moment, standing in a parking lot in Millfield on a Wednesday afternoon with a 71-year-old man who had just gone to war on my behalf without raising his voice once, made my throat tighten in a way I hadn't let happen yet. I said, "Thank you for believing me." He looked at me like I'd said something strange. "Why wouldn't I believe you?" I didn't have a good answer for that, but I understood, standing there, that I'd spent so many years in a house where my word came second that I had started to assume that was universal. It wasn't. What happened next is the part that made the news. Grandpa James had spent 31 years as a high school principal in Millfield before retiring. 31 years of homecoming games and graduation ceremonies and parent-teacher conferences and budget meetings and the thousand small and large decisions that come with running a school. In 3 decades, he had built relationships with almost everyone in the county: community leaders, school board members, local journalists, longtime residents who had sent their kids through his halls and still waved to him at the grocery store. After we left Franklin's office, he called Denise Harmon. Denise was a reporter for the regional television affiliate who had once been a student of his, 20-some years ago, back when she was a 17-year-old in his English elective, who, according to Grandpa James, had never once turned in an assignment on time but could write circles around anyone in the room. She'd gone on to journalism school and come back to the region, and they'd stayed in loose contact the way you do with people who shaped you before you knew they were shaping you. Grandpa James called her that same Wednesday afternoon. He told her the story, all of it, no omissions. She listened for a long time without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked if he'd be willing to sit down with a camera. He said yes. She came to his house that Friday with a camera crew. He sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd told me about the account when I was 11, the same table with the ceiling fan overhead, with the original account documentation spread in front of him, and told the entire story on camera without flinching once. He was 71 years old. He was calm as a Sunday morning, and every single word he said was the truth. The segment aired on the Thursday evening news under the headline, "Grandfather accuses daughter of stealing grandson's $187,000 college fund." By 9 o'clock that night, it had been shared hundreds of times on social media. By Friday morning, a regional outlet had picked it up. By Saturday, a national wire service ran it. I was at Grandpa James's house when the story aired. We watched it together in his living room, the same room where he kept the framed photographs of Grandma Carol and the shelf of books he'd been reading and rereading for decades. When the segment ended, I looked over at him and he was just sitting there with his hands folded in his lap, watching the screen like he was watching the weather forecast. Not triumphant, not emotional, just present. I asked him if he had any doubts about doing it. He said, "Your grandmother worked night shifts for 6 years when we were first married. She did it so we could build something. If I let someone take that without saying a word, what did all of it mean?" He paused. No doubts." My mother's response came fast. A long Facebook post, carefully worded, calling it a family misunderstanding and asking for privacy and prayers during a difficult time. It was written with just enough vagueness to avoid saying anything specific, and just enough emotional language to position her as someone wounded by the situation rather than responsible for it. I read it once and didn't read it again. But the comments underneath told a different story. People who had known our family for years, who had known Grandpa James for decades, who had watched my mother perform graciousness at church functions and school events and community dinners for as long as anyone could remember, were not buying it. The ground that the post was trying to stand on simply wasn't there. Several people noted publicly that UTMA accounts are not family property. A former neighbor of ours, a woman who had lived 2 houses down on Crescent Drive for most of my childhood, wrote that she wasn't surprised, and left it there without elaborating, which somehow said more than elaboration would have. A woman my mother had worked with at a real estate office years ago commented that she had lent her money that was never returned. Someone else mentioned a church fundraiser that had gone sideways and never been explained. I hadn't known about any of these things, but they surfaced now, one by one, because that's what happens when a narrative cracks. The things people had privately noted and set aside and chosen not to make a fuss about suddenly had context. They were no longer isolated incidents. They were a pattern. The narrative my mother had been constructing for years of herself as a devoted, self-sacrificing mother doing her best for her family was coming undone in real time. Not because anyone was attacking her, not because there was a coordinated campaign against her, but because the truth has its own momentum once it starts moving. You can maintain a version of yourself for a long time if the people around you never compare notes. When they do, the version can't hold. Inside our house, things were different. Kayla had been kept in the dark about where the down payment for her house had actually come from. My mother had shown her fabricated bank documents. Indicating a family savings account that didn't exist, making the transfer look legitimate. When the story broke publicly, Kayla found out the truth the same way everyone else did. From the news. I don't know exactly what happened between them after that, because Kayla and I weren't speaking much in those weeks. The situation was too complicated, too layered, too full of things neither of us knew how to hold at the same time. But I know that Kayla retained her own attorney shortly after the story broke, and that she cooperated fully with the investigation, and that whatever relationship she and my mother had before all of this was not the relationship they had after. My father, Gerald, had stayed silent through the entire confrontation and the days that followed. I don't know what he knew or when he knew it. What I know is that when the investigation formally opened, he retained his own separate attorney, cooperated with prosecutors, and accepted a plea to a lesser charge. He agreed to pay his portion of the restitution. He stood in the courtroom on the day of his hearing, looking like a man who had lost something he hadn't realized he was spending. Which is, I think, exactly what had happened. He and I have not spoken since. I don't know if we ever will. I've made my peace with not knowing. The DA opened a formal investigation 6 weeks after the story aired. Bank records were subpoenaed. Every withdrawal was documented, time-stamped, and cross-referenced against transaction thresholds in a pattern that Franklin described in a later conversation as calculated. The withdrawals had been spaced deliberately, never close enough together to trigger automatic fraud alerts, never large enough in any single transaction to draw immediate attention, but consistent and systematic over 9 months. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a moment of poor judgment under financial pressure. Someone had thought about how to do it without being caught and had done it that way. Franklin had warned me early on that the word premeditation changes things legally. Poor judgment and premeditation are not the same standard. Good faith misunderstanding is a defense that can survive a lot of circumstances. It does not survive fabricated documentation. My mother held out longer than my father. Her attorney cycled through several arguments: custodial discretion, family necessity, good faith misunderstanding, and each one ran into the same wall: the fabricated bank statements she had shown my sister to make the house purchase look legitimate. The moment those documents entered the record, the nature of the case changed. You cannot accidentally fabricate documents. You cannot fabricate documents in good faith. The existence of those documents said, more clearly than any testimony could, that she had known exactly what she was doing and had taken steps to conceal it. In the end, she accepted a felony plea. 5 years of probation, restitution, community service hours. The specific terms of the agreement included structured repayment over several years, with the restitution funds directed into a protected trust in my name. She did not say sorry in the courtroom. She signed the paperwork and left without making eye contact with anyone. I was there. I watched her do it. I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. I had expected something like relief or closure or grief, or all three at once. What I actually felt was much quieter than that. Something closer to the feeling you get when a storm has finally passed and you're standing outside in the stillness afterward, and the world is just the world again. Changed, but still. Meanwhile, Grandpa James did one more thing I hadn't asked him to do and hadn't expected. He called the university's admissions office directly. He explained the situation, not emotionally, not dramatically, just factually, the way he did everything, and asked whether there was anything that could be done given the circumstances. The admissions office transferred him to the scholarship committee. The scholarship committee reviewed my full academic record. Within 2 weeks of the story breaking, they awarded me a full 4-year merit scholarship. A teacher from my high school, Miss Pratt, who had taught my AP English class junior year and had written one of my college recommendation letters, saw the news story and started a fundraiser for my first year's living expenses. It reached $64,000 in 3 days. I still don't fully understand how that happened. I think it was partly the story itself, partly the speed at which it spread, and partly something about Grandpa James sitting at that kitchen table, this 71-year-old man in a button-up shirt, calm as anything, holding those original documents. That made people want to respond. There's something about witnessing a person do the right thing without any performance in it that moves people in a way that curated outrage never does. Grandpa James wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't performing injury. He was just telling the truth about what had happened to his grandson and asking the world to see it clearly. People saw it. Grandpa James also worked with Franklin to establish a new protected trust to receive the restitution funds as they came in, structured with a corporate trustee, no family custodians, legally walled off from any future interference. He was thorough in a way that suggested he had thought about the vulnerability that had allowed this to happen in the first place and had closed every door he could find. I started school on time, full scholarship, dorm room, living expenses covered. A new protected account accumulating restitution payments in the background. 3 weeks after the worst phone call of my life, I moved into my dorm room with a plastic storage bin, a shower caddy from Target, and a grandfather who had gone to war on my behalf without ever once raising his voice. On move-in day, Grandpa James drove the 40 minutes from Millfield in his truck, helped me carry boxes up 2 flights of stairs, looked around the room when everything was in, and said, "This is a good room." Then he shook my hand, drove home, and called me that Sunday at 6 o'clock, the same as always. College, when it finally started, felt like walking into a room with more oxygen in it. I don't mean that as a metaphor. I mean it almost physically. That first week on campus, moving between classes and the dining hall and the quad, I kept noticing that I felt different in a way I couldn't immediately name. It took me a few days to identify it. I wasn't bracing for anything. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't monitoring someone else's mood or measuring my own accomplishments against whether they'd be acknowledged or quietly ignored. I was just there, present, mine. I'd carried a low-level vigilance for so long that I hadn't recognized it as vigilance. I thought it was just how I was. It wasn't. It was a response to the environment I'd grown up in. Take away the environment, and something in your nervous system slowly starts to unknot. I declared my major in the second week of freshman year. I went to office hours. I made friends slowly, the way I make most things, carefully, with attention. I called Grandpa James every Sunday at 6. He always picked up before the second ring. The calls were ordinary in the best possible way. He'd tell me about the garden, what was still producing late into fall, what he'd already pulled up, what he was planning to put in come spring. I'd tell him about whatever I'd been reading, whatever class was giving me trouble, whatever small thing had happened that week worth mentioning. We didn't talk about the trial much. We didn't need to. It had happened, it was resolving itself in the background, and we had moved forward. Once, toward the end of first semester, I asked him if he ever regretted making it public, going to Denise Harmon, letting the story air. He was quiet for a moment in the way he gets when he's actually considering something rather than preparing an answer. Then he said, "I regret that it had to happen. I don't regret what I did." He paused. "There's a difference." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. There's a difference between regretting that something was necessary and regretting that you did the necessary thing. My whole life, I'd been confusing those two. I'd been treating the pain of a hard situation as evidence that I'd done something wrong by responding to it. I hadn't. Some situations are painful no matter what you do. The question is whether you're also going to carry the weight of having done nothing. I wasn't carrying that weight anymore. My dorm window looks out over a quad where students cut across the frost-covered grass between classes. I watch them sometimes from my desk, heads down, coffee cups in hand, rushing between one thing and the next. On my desk, there's one photograph. Grandpa James and me at my high school graduation, him in his gray blazer, me in my cap and gown. Both of us squinting into the afternoon sun, and both of us, if you look closely enough, trying not to smile too wide because neither of us is really the type. I'm not telling you this story for sympathy. Sympathy wasn't what changed anything. Sympathy is what people offered for years while the situation continued unchanged. Oh, that's hard. And families are complicated. And I'm sure she means well. Sympathy kept the peace. Sympathy was permission wearing a softer name. I'm telling you this story because I spent 18 years being the easy one, the self-sufficient one, the one who didn't need anything and therefore wasn't given anything. I built an entire identity around not being a burden, around never requiring rescue, around absorbing whatever came at me and staying upright. I thought that was strength. I thought staying quiet was a form of dignity. I was wrong. Staying quiet wasn't strength. It was consent. Every time I accepted being overlooked, I was confirming that it was acceptable to overlook me. Every time I made peace with being treated as secondary, I was ratifying the arrangement. I wasn't being strong. I was making it easier for people to continue. When I stopped doing that, when I made one phone call to one person who had never once in my life treated my reality as less valid than someone else's, everything changed. Not gradually, not eventually. The trajectory of my life changed within weeks. The scholarship existed. The support existed. The legal protections existed. All of it was already there. The only thing standing between me and all of it was that I hadn't yet understood that I was worth standing up for. So if you're sitting somewhere right now, if you're the overlooked one, the capable one, the one who keeps the peace at the cost of your own peace, the one who's been told your whole life that your needs are less urgent, your feelings less fragile, your situation less of an emergency, I want you to hear this clearly. You are worth standing up for, even when the person you're standing up against shares your last name. Setting a boundary is not burning a bridge. It is building a door, and only you decide who walks through it. The people in your life who truly love you will respect that door. They may not like it at first. They may push back, or feel hurt, or tell you you're overreacting. But love, the real kind, the Grandpa James kind, the kind that drives 40 minutes to cross-country meets and frames certificates in a hallway and calls Franklin Webb first thing in the morning. That love doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller to receive it. It meets you where you are and says, "We'll figure this out." If you don't have that person in your life yet, I want you to know that it's possible. It starts with deciding that you deserve it. I call Grandpa James every Sunday at 6. He always picks up before the second ring. He told me last week his garden is dormant for the season, but he's already planning the spring beds. I told him I'd come help in April. He said he'd believe it when he saw it. I'm coming in April. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story resonated with you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever been the one in your family who was taken from, whether it was money, or trust, or simply the feeling of being seen, I want to hear your story. There's another video in the description about a man whose siblings tried to contest his grandmother's will the day after the funeral. The way he handled it is worth every minute. I'll see you there.